Although it makes sense to us that education is going to have a positive effect on earnings, especially college education, the 6 to 11% premium that a lot of studies have estimated does seem reasonable. However, there are some issues with the estimation that are worth discussing. There are some potential biases in these equations that may result in overestimating or underestimating just how large the college wage premium is. So in this case, if there is bias, it may not be the wage premiums are reflecting the education. It may be that there's something else, like the individual's underlying ability, that we're isolating and that we're measuring. So we're going to explore two potential biases, or the availability bias and the selection bias, which may be making our results inaccurate. So there's a fairly old adage that most of what you learn in college is useless, that you learn most of what you need for your career on the job when you first start. So if this is true, in this case, education wouldn't be acting as job training. It's doing something else. So some economists, starting with Michael Spence and Kenneth Arrow, argued that education signals an ability of the individual. So it's basically showing that you have this underlying ability, that you're smart, that you can learn on the job, that you'll be able to figure out what you have to do when you start working, not that you're building the skills that you're going to take with you to that job. So it's not exactly what you learn in college. It's a costly way to demonstrate to employers that you can learn. And the reason why I signify that it's costly is that if it's not costly, if it's easy to do, then anyone who doesn't have those skills and ability can go ahead and do it. So it's going to take time. It takes 4 years to go to college. It can be expensive with tuition. And depending on your major, there can be quite a bit of studying, a lot of tests, a lot of work you have to do. For someone who's more highly skilled, this may be a lot easier than for someone who doesn't have the skills. Now, this might sound cynical, that you spend 4 years in college, spend all this money just so you can prove to someone else that you're able to learn on the job later. But if you go over to the history department, it's an argument they'll make for you for why you should get a history degree. I remember being told when I was an undergrad that studying history in college teaches critical thinking skills that are useful for employers, and they can go ahead and teach you the specifics on the job. So some people, even in academia, do recognize that there's at least some truth to this signaling aspect of education. So basically, ability bias says that firms pay workers not because education has made them more productive. That's not the reason, but because getting through college shows or signals to them that the person is more intelligent than other workers because they were able to do this difficult thing. So some of the reason may be that they take workers with a college degree and they put them into more productive roles. So it makes them appear more productive, but it's really the tasks that make them appear so. So in this case, businesses may think it represents the underlying ability, and they end up giving them jobs where they can use their natural ability more when they really don't have that much more than someone without a college degree. So there's multiple reasons how this ability bias could come into play. Now, because of what's called asymmetric information, signaling can be very useful. So basically, workers have a good idea about their skill level, but the hiring firm does not. So we call this asymmetric information. One side, the employee or potential employee knows, relatively how good they are, how smart they are, if they have the skills necessary for this job. The firm doesn't. They try to get at that through the application process, but they don't know for sure. So there's this asymmetry in the information. One side has a lot more than the other. So this can cause problems in the hiring process. It can draw it out. It can make it very difficult for firms to actually make decisions on who to bring in. So in Spence's job market signaling model, the potential employees send a signal about their ability to the employer by acquiring these education credentials, and these expensive and time-consuming education credentials. The informational value of the credential comes from the fact that the employer believes that this college degree is positively correlated with a greater ability, and it's difficult for low ability employees to obtain this degree. So it's basically they have to believe that this is an effective mechanism to recognize those skills. So they can use this credential to reliably distinguish between the low ability workers and the high ability workers. Now, like I mentioned, for the signal to be effective, it has to be costly to acquire. If anyone can go ahead and acquire the signal, regardless of their skill level, then employers can't rely on it. It has to be something that is easier for more highly skilled people and more difficult for more low skilled people. Now, your textbook walks you through an example using high skilled and low skilled workers. I'll let you read through the specifics rather than explaining the same exact thing here again. But what's really important here, and what I want you to focus on in your reading, is the outcomes. So because it's more costly for a low skilled worker to get a college degree, they're going to choose not to invest in the education. For them, the cost is going to be too high relative to the wage that they're going to receive. So it results in what we call a separating equilibrium. Basically, we have two separate best choices for workers, whether they're high skilled or low skilled. So those with higher skills get a college education. The returns for them are worth it. The cost is lower than the rewards they're going to get in their career. Meanwhile, the low skilled people are not going to go get a college degree because for them, the cost is too high relative to the benefits that they're going to get throughout their career. So if education builds human capital and human capital is the driver of the wage premium, then students would make the exact same choices as they would if education was entirely about signaling. So basically, it doesn't matter which one of these two are right. We would see the same exact thing happening. So that means that we can't look at how workers choose education to try to get at the real effect. But there are some other ways that we do this. We just need to be more creative, use some fun or interesting statistical techniques and different tests. So it can be difficult to measure ability directly, but there are some ways we can try to get at it. One of the most common ways is by using IQ as a measure of intellectual ability. But other times, some studies have used specific or performances on specific tests. So if we take that Mincer equation we talked about in the last set of slides, and we include a measure of ability in that, we can control for the differences in ability, or at least some of the differences in ability between workers. So we can try to get at that true effect of the education. Most of the work that does this, whether they use IQ or whether they use specific tests, within an industry or within a large firm, finds that the education premium shrinks by a small amount from what, the 6 to 11% estimates, but the education premium is still present and pretty close to the size that they estimate. So we don't see a large bias. Another interesting method is by comparing identical twins. Now, this is common in literature, in education literature, excuse me, because you can remove a lot of different effects. You can remove the effects of family environment. You can remove effects on just like different genetics, like between people, from different teachers, different schools, a whole host of things that can impact educational attainment. So again, using these identical twin studies, we find that educational premium that we measured still exists and is only slightly overestimated in the normal models without controlling for ability. So economists can also try to use a statistical trick, which is what your textbook calls it, called instrumental variables. The idea behind this is that you find a variable that affects someone's decision to undergo education or how much education they want to undergo, but is unrelated to the person's natural ability. Again, for this, you need to be more creative for. So one thing that they used, or some economists used in the past, was the draft for the Vietnam War. So young men were being selected at random to be sent over to Vietnam in the military, but they could avoid the draft by being engaged in education. So some chose to extend their education because they were drafted. So these people were randomly selected, and they didn't make their choice for college based off of ability. They did it based off of being drafted. So using this, they could isolate the effect of education and remove the effect of the person's underlying ability. And they found a slight increase in the college premium using this method. Now, we should expect that signaling would be useful in some fields, but it's not going to be valuable in other fields. For instance, self-employed people aren't going to need signaling because they're the ones, working in they don't need a signal to themselves for how good they are. On the other hand, being an engineer without taking a single math course or a nurse without taking any healthcare courses would be incredibly difficult. So there's some fields where we say, okay, there may be some signaling involved here, but in other fields, it's definitely the skills that they build up ahead of time are necessary. Most studies using this method find little to no ability bias in education premiums. So what I mean is that they find these wage premiums for college education are pretty accurately estimated. And we would also expect that signaling is important in the early stages of one's career. Well, and there's little evidence of professional output. When you're first starting out, there's not a lot that you can show to employers to prove how good you are. So they have to rely on that signal from the college degree. However, as an employee gets older, they advance in their career, they have tangible outputs that they can use to clearly demonstrate their skills much more effectively than a college diploma. So later in a worker's career, we would expect that the college wage premium to disappear if it was the result of ability bias. In fact, we see the premium persist over workers' careers. So it's not that it's a result of the higher. It's not a result of the ability. It's the college education itself that's doing that. Now, finally, some economists have tried using macroeconomic studies. So they're examining the effects of average education levels between countries, and they're comparing growth rates between countries. Unsurprisingly, countries with higher levels of education have higher levels of economic growth. Now, another issue we face when trying to estimate the returns to education is the sample that we use. So in statistics, we rarely get information from every single person in the population. We don't ask every single person in America, every single worker in America, what their wages are when we do these studies. We have to select a sample of them or a certain percentage to conduct our analysis on. If the sample we choose isn't representative of the entire population, then our results can be biased. We'll end up with an inaccurate understanding of the question that we're trying to answer, basically. So, for instance, if we only chose from people who were employed in our sample, we'd miss everyone who didn't have a job. But some of the people who are unemployed receive an education. The education may not have been good enough. They may just be temporarily unemployed. They may have made a lot of money and retired. The amount of money they make from their college degree may not be worth it for them. They would rather engage in leisure rather than work because they don't think the money is enough. So there's plenty of reasons, but if we don't account for them, our results can be off. We can be inaccurate in our estimation of what the true effect of a college degree is. This is going to be a serious problem for the college wage premium, particularly for females in our sample. So why might we have trouble selecting a representative sample of females? Women typically interrupt their career around childbirth. Often they choose to return to work, right after maternity leave, but some end up taking more time off to recover and care for young children. Others may choose to leave the labor force for a much longer time or opt to work part-time when they do return. So part of the reason that the return to work, part of the reason behind their choice to return to work is their earnings potential in their career. So remember last chapter with the leisure work choice, leisure counts as everything that's not work. So that includes childcare. So women with higher wages face a higher opportunity cost of leaving the labor force. So basically what we mean is they're giving up more because of their higher salaries. So by analyzing only workers, only those in the labor force and who are actively working now, we would count these women, but we're not counting those with lower returns to education. So we'll end up biasing our estimates of the wage premium upwards. Likewise, we've seen a number of young men leave the labor force over the past decade and a half, 2 decades. If their returns to education were lower, again, we're going to be overestimating the effect of a college degree by including them in our analysis and only including them in our analysis. Now, somewhat surprisingly, despite the fact that we think that this would bias our results upwards, and some may think it could be considerable, in practice, we found some evidence that any bias is exceedingly small. So again, these estimates we're doing without taking into account the selection bias and the ability bias turn out to be pretty accurate. So far, we've not considered any differences between the types of human capital. We've just thought of all human capital the same. You get an education, it makes you just more skilled. On a scale of 1 to 100, we don't think of any different applications for it. But all education isn't going to be interchangeable. So some education can be applied to a small number of jobs, while others can help workers in a whole host of careers. In this course, you're learning or continuing to develop skills that hopefully are more general than the labor econ that you can use in a variety of settings. So things like weighing evidence and reaching a conclusion, making an argument, supporting it with facts, basic numeracy, and communication with others. These are examples of general human capital. So these can apply to no matter what job you get, things that you can use and to be more skilled. There's other skills that can be more helpful in far more narrow circumstances and roles. So what we consider specific human capital. This comes primarily from on-the-job training and experience. So this is a lot of the local knowledge of the inner workings of a firm. They can only be learned through time working at that firm. So the best example I could think of is from when I worked in the warehouse at a furniture factory in college. There was Sandy in upholstery, and she'd been in the upholstery department for 30 years. She knew every single thing about that place. If we ever needed anything, we didn't know where it was, or if there was something happened, we didn't know what to do. We could go straight to her and ask her, and because she'd been there so long, she knew everything about what to do just from experiencing it. So she had the specific human capital at much higher than anyone else that worked there. Now, a typical worker is going to have both general human capital and specific human capital. Firms are going to be reluctant to invest in general human capital because a worker can take that and use it to succeed at any other firm. So there's not going to help them retain the employee. If they spend tens of thousands of dollars for your education and you leave the company after 3 years, they're going to be out all that money with very little to show for it. So they're going to be reluctant to pay for workers' general human capital and to develop those sorts of skills. Now, specific human capital is a different story. If a company makes an investment in the specific human capital of a worker, it will only be valuable while the worker is at that firm. So if they leave, any benefit to them is going to be lost going forward. Only while they're at that employer is that specific human capital going to be valuable. So the employer can make an investment with confidence in specific human capital because they will benefit from the investment, not any other firm. They don't have to worry about paying that time to train the person and then having them leave to get a better job elsewhere. So the worker is going to be worth more to the firm than they would be elsewhere. The firm is going to end up paying the employee less than their marginal product, which benefits the firm, but the worker is going to earn more there than at any other firm, benefiting them. So we get gains from investment in specific human capital being shared by the employee in the firm. They earn more than they would with that level of skills at any other job. And the firm can pay them a little bit less than their marginal product. So both end up doing better. So we tend to see firms invest fairly heavily in specific human capital, not general human capital. Now, I know what you're thinking, that this is kind of a weird dividing line between the two. And there is definitely a mix between the two, where human capital is most useful at one firm, but it can be transferred to a small number of other firms. And we typically see this when people choose to leave their employer. They typically choose an employer in the same industry. So they're not switching to something completely different. They often do something fairly similar. They can take a lot of their expertise from their experience of their previous job and use that at their new job.